Most often, when people immigrate to another country, it's for necessity. Perhaps their home country isn't doing so well economically, or there aren't enough skilled jobs. What's interesting about this migration is that once someone permanently settles in a new country, the dynamic between person, home, and family changes not only on an individual level, but it creates new patterns and phenomena on a macro level as well. Within families, different generations will experience very different kinds of relationships to their homeland, but we're all members of the same diaspora. When my parents decided to leave the Philippines, they did it because they thought they would have a better life in America. My dad was a surgeon and my mom an accountant. They were smart and ambitious, and they believed in the American dream. They wanted to make enough money to not only live comfortably, but to be able to support our family back home as well. On a macro level, the remittances sent home by Filipinos abroad bolstered the Filipino economy and took over 10% of GDP growth. In Dealing in Desire, Kimberly Kay Hoang draws several parallels between global financial inflows and their effects on individual relationships to Vietnam. She describes the dynamic of the Viet Q, overseas Vietnamese workers who, when they would go back for vacation, searched for spaces where they could feel a sense of Asian superiority because they often felt the opposite in their jobs abroad. In her study, the Viet Q would go to clubs where they could feel like superstars, and thus helped fund an industry of sex workers who were able to make a stable living. I found this portion of her study especially interesting because I saw similarities in how the Viet Q felt with how my parents felt as minorities in the US. However, the relationship my parents had with the Philippines played out very differently. The Vietnamese economy was on the rise during Hoang's study, and the Viet Q felt that they had personally contributed to that through their remittances, so they wanted to celebrate that Asian ascendancy. The difference is that the Philippines wasn't ascendant when my parents first moved to the US. This created a very different dynamic when my parents would go home to visit. Rather than searching for spaces where they could feel superior, they only sought that feeling of being home with their family and friends whom they dearly missed. This isn't to say that the desire to feel superior didn't exist, but it wasn't as pronounced in my parents' case, nor in most cases. There are also some cultural elements that seem to push back on the possibility of our ever feeling or wanting superiority. In moving to a new country, there's often pressure to assimilate into the community. A dominant force for Filipinos is the culture of hiya, which loosely translates to shame. It's different from shame in that it's not a reactive feeling, but a proactive feeling. Hiya makes Filipinos try to avoid feeling shameful. While my parents never made it so that we should feel shameful about our culture, aspects of hiya would creep into our lives in subverted ways. With food, for example. I loved Filipino food growing up, but when non-Filipino friends came over my house, my mom would purposely order pizza or some other kind of unobjectionable food. Although it was a decision made with good intention, it made me feel that Filipino food was lower quality than other foods. My sisters, who we colloquially refer to as from the 1.5 generation, spent half of their lives in the Philippines and the other half in the US. They managed to straddle both worlds while still maintaining a deep connection to the homeland. As a second-generation Filipino-American, I am in an odd in-between. I used to only know my Filipino heritage secondhand from my parents, having never experienced it myself. Growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood in New York, I often felt that being Filipino didn't mean anything more to me than the color of my skin. This aversion to introducing people to our culture for fear that they would reject it, coupled with my already disengaged connection with Filipino culture, made it so that I couldn't see much value in the culture to begin with. When I got to college, things flipped. Suddenly, my Filipino culture, accessed through Georgetown's Club Filipino, was the place where I felt most comfortable. I started to form a real connection to the Philippines that was built purely on my own, through friends, books, and ultimately a transformative fellowship that showed me a dynamic and ascendant side of the Philippines I never knew before. It impacted me so much that I decided I wanted to be a part of the change that I saw happening there. In 2016, I took a gap year to live and work in the Philippine social sector and grow the program that changed my life. In 2016, the Philippine economy also became the fastest growing in Asia. Just as Vietnamese ascendancy pulled the Viet Q back home to celebrate it, I began to feel that the Philippines offered me opportunities for personal growth that I wouldn't be able to get in America. While my parents never felt that sense of Asian superiority, I was able to experience a side of the Philippines that felt more powerful than they ever described to me. In some exploratory research I did for an article on this phenomena, I found that I was far from alone. In fact, there was a small but growing sect of Filipino diaspora who have been returning to the Philippines and staying to work in fields they are needed most. While my parents plan to live comfortably in the U.S. for the rest of their lives, 1.5 and second-generation immigrants seem to be returning to the Philippines to be a part of that ascendancy. It's quite possible that this won't last. The Philippines still has a number of issues, and some people have a hard time dealing with those. I'm optimistic about the future, though. While my parents left the Philippines at a time when their connections could only live on in the form of short vacations and sending money back home, technology, social media, and the new global economy are making it much easier for the younger generation to feel excited by what's going on in the Philippines and to play a role in what comes next.